Hello, I'm Peter Cox of the University of Chester, and this is one part of a pair of linked presentations that can be seen to reflect in part the UCU campaign Decolonise and Decarbonise. And in order to think about the processes of decarbonisation, I want to get realistic. Decarbonisation will require substantial reductions in carbon outputs, and that can't be achieved without significant structural social change. If you're wondering about the degrowth bit, a really useful analysis comes from Leahy and Nelson 2020, Exploring Degrowth. I'll return to that later. But I want to start with them because they make the brilliant linkage that degrowth requires us to decolonize the growth imagination. What connects the multiple complex problems we face, they argue, is a shared dependence on a logic of constant expansionism. So the central concern of this presentation is to consider how action on cycling begins to address this problem. Or, alternatively, does cycling as low carbon mobility risk providing a lifeline for more broadly unsustainable high carbon societies? Sustainable solutions alone, each addressing a specific problem, do not make for a sustainable system, I will argue. So we have to start thinking about where we are today. The latest reports on climate change are not promising. Kerry's London speech on 20th of the 7th this year was just one most notable to restate the findings of the 2019 high-level report to the WHO, which, if you haven't read it, I would hugely recommend. The IPCC reports or the Committee on Climate Change reports in the UK all highlight the scale of transformation required. And I want just to add to this the language of crisis isn't necessarily helpful. We experience crises, we deal with them, we return to normal. Crisis suggests we're facing a temporary problem that can be fixed. Justin Spinney's work on urban fixes is highly recommended here. If we take these reports seriously, we can see that there can be no return to business as normal. Substantial permanent transformations are required, and we will have to keep adapting and changing. Especially, that is, in the most carbon-intensive economies, we will require transformation to address both existing patterns of energy use and the trajectories of change. No one is currently going in a direction toward the necessary low carbon solutions. Now, mobility systems are a significant part of the current patterns of unsustainability. Yes, cycling's part of the transition, but cycling to replace some short distance car journeys is just not enough. So the aim of this paper is to think a little more deeply about the role of cycling in transitions. And to do this requires a multi-dimensional approach, to go beyond cycling and to see its role in a bigger picture. In other words, to study cycling and society, we might need, for a while at least, to stop focusing on cycling. So we're faced with a wicked problem. Wicked problems are those where every solution given creates another problem. It's like squeezing a balloon. It just pops out somewhere else. The unsustainability of current transport scenarios is obvious. We're all experts in listing the disbenefits. We're also experts in listing the benefits of more cycling, but there's a problem. What we risk ending up with is solutionism. We're familiar with the declared goal of much advocacy, more cycling, more often, by more people. But I suggest that just calling for more cycling addresses the symptoms without confronting the structural problems. How have we got here? Well, if pushed, the benefits of cycling are appended to other irrefutable social goods: sustainability, better health, urban livability, city competitiveness. But these are actually what I would call null values. Who would be against any of those things? What these null values do is to depoliticize cycling. This is huge value as strategic action. Cycling isn't a political issue. To argue that it ensures the survival of cycling in hostile political environments. It assures the inclusion of cycling in favourable political environments. A non-ideological framing that separates cycling from any other issue allows cross-party support. It depoliticises the debate. But depoliticisation of any issue creates a void. Because they can be appended to anything, such issues belong to no one. For cycling, this has also meant that any linkage to other political interventions is discontinued. It's particularly problematic in relation to issues of social equality and inclusion, where the problem becomes visible. Academics and activists have then to fight a whole series of rearguard actions on a range of issues, including gender, impairments, ethnic exclusions, gentrification. Business as usual provides social structures that are not simply tolerant of inequalities, but which reproduce them. And this is where we connect up with the colonial. The histories of colonialism are not separate issues. They're constitutive of the current state of global social relations. Coloniality is also repeated in relation to domestic economies. It's not just about internationally. Within the nation, it delegitimizes certain ways of being, especially around class and regionality. Within the household, for example, it devalorizes gendered labour, work that patriarchal social relations assigns to women. The last thing we need to be complicit in is the replication of business as usual. So cycling, we'll shift focus a moment, back to cycling. And cycling, and where is it talked about as urban cycling? A particular note here is the role of cycling advocacy in allying cycling to the city. So proposals almost exclusively centre on cycling as an urban phenomenon. This is intrinsically interesting. It forms part of a shift of rhetoric from urbanisation as a problem to urbanisation as the only possible way to find a solution. And in the urban context, cycling appears to be and is presented as the most efficient transport solution. Now, we must also remember that the city is posited and serves as the point of a maximum reproduction and accumulation of capital. Cycling as the efficient solution to urban mobility becomes the key to ensuring the continued maximum reproduction and accumulation of capital. Now, I admit, urban cycling advocacy can be understood logically as strategic essentialism. Only this time, it's not just a depoliticisation, but specifically wedded to a political goal, that of the reproduction and accumulation of capital. That is, cycling becomes wedded to a particular political economic arrangement. That we don't think of it as such as part of a greater triumph of domination of a singular narrative. Human flourishing has become synonymous with the maximisation of economic growth. Cycling advocacy, as Kaimoto argues, buys into that at the risk of losing any hope of being wedded to other transformations. So we come back to these twin problems of cycling, of sustainability, and where are the limits? Because sustainability has undergone the same deliberate depoliticisation in the 35 years since Our Common Future was published. That is better known as the Brundtland Report for the World Commission on Environment and Development. The useful utility of the depoliticisation of sustainability is that it has achieved wide agreement on its desirability, but that's been coupled with minimal action on implementation. 5 years of concerted citizen action has changed the picture a little. Using tactics from protest to legal challenges to government policy, citizen action has alerted public opinion to the reach of the carbon economy, but carbon consumption still increases. In its original analysis, economic sustainability was a tertiary product derived from use of society, that is labour, and environment, that is resources and raw material. These are combined, transformed, and the means of utilization and exchange was the economy. Now, sustainability discourse, I will argue here, was politically co-opted and even hijacked to explore how environment and society could be manipulated in ways that ensured the continued prevalence of a dominant economic growth model. Instead of managing the primary resources and finding an economic process that enables the continued security of those resources are manipulated to ensure the continuity of an economic model. So as a result of focus on atmospheric carbon accumulation, there's increasing recognition in sustainability circles that if we're not that more fundamental shifts are required if we are not to make ecosystems uninhabitable. Now, enabling business as usual is not an option if that business as usual creates social inequalities that are not sustainable, or if in solving those inequalities demands destruction of ecosystems crucial for the support of life. Business as usual plays off environment against society. Reducing sustainability to the maintenance of economic growth continues to play off people against planet, social justice versus carbon reduction and environmental protection. Now, this same critical gaze must apply to cycling policy. What's it really for? What's it really functioning as? And this is where I'll come back to Leger and Nelson's idea of degrowth. They argue that degrowth requires us to decolonize our growth imaginaries. Cycling as transport and thus cycling policy has become entangled with debates on sustainability, whether one considers it a good strategic move or not, whether one approves or not. They are entwined, but they are generally entwined within what I've just explained as the dominant narratives of sustainability that are about the sustaining economic growth, not the planet. So sustainable transport policies have become the means through which cycling has become a player in international transport policy debates. That's great, but they're generally framed as a main means to maintain business as usual, except just with lower carbon emissions. So to effect a dramatic rethink, I want to pose some questions. And I've got very little to say about these, except to suggest that some of the solutions we're talking about now are potentially very valuable ways forward. We need to ask about cycling and sufficiency. When is sufficient? When is enough in mobility terms? What does human scale mobility and cycling mean? Where do we travel and why? How are mobility needs and desires created and fed? How does planning and regulation shape mobilities? But if we're going to think about practical answers to these questions, we also need to ensure that they're constituted in systemic form, not just as specific individual solutions. So I'm going to end with a slogan. Velomobility is to degrowth, or has to be to degrowth, as automobility is and has been to growth. I'm proposing, as much of my recent work has deliberately adopted this language of velomobility, to describe it not just the practices of cycling, but as a systemic analysis of an alternative to automobility. And this means confronting automobility's role as a primary means for the reproduction of carbon capital. What we don't want to end up with is cycling as a sustainable component in an otherwise unsustainable system of transport and mobilities. And so I'm going to end there and thank you very much for your engagement.